All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for coming back. I know you're kind of captive audience, but... All right, so this is the first part of my presentation that we're going to be talking about basically what is dyslexia, what kind of things can you look for when you're looking to say, you know, oh, could this kid possibly have dyslexia? And then after lunch, we'll come back and we'll talk about accommodations. So what I'm going to do right now, there's going to be a whole lot of things that you're going to be like, what do I do about that? What do I do about that? After lunch, we're going to talk about what you do about it. So just hold that thought and we'll be there. But if you have questions, again, write them down. They may get answered after lunch. But if not, if they do, then you can mark them off. But if not, then you can leave them on there and give that back to me. So, all right. So I'm not used to this whole clicker thing. So, all right. So what is dyslexia? Kind of in a nutshell. Simply put, dyslexia is an inherited neurological language-based learning difference that causes children, even those with normal or higher than normal intelligence, to struggle learning to read, write, and spell in the way schools typically teach. And by the way, you guys do have all this on your handouts. There's a lot of information on my slides because I was hoping that you wouldn't have to write a whole lot. I want you to be able to listen. My husband was like, oh my gosh, you put so much stuff on there. I'm kind of wordy anyway, but just so that you have all the information. I'll probably say some things that you might want to write down that aren't on there, but a lot of it's on there. Oops. Oh, wait. Okay, it doesn't change mine, it changes that. Okay, it's going to take me a little while to get to this. I'm used to hitting the button on mine, but for some reason, mine's not wanting to do anything. It's frozen. All right, we're just going to do this. So I have to have my phone. Okay. So what dyslexia is not. So there's a lot of myths about dyslexia out there. And so one of them is that a lot of times when you say, oh, I'm a dyslexia consultant, oh, that's where kids read words backwards. That's what I hear all the time. No, that's not what it is. But that's what a lot of people think. Individuals with dyslexia do not read words backwards. Dyslexia is not a vision problem, although many of these kids do have vision issues that come along with it, especially like a visual processing disorder. It's a separate thing, but a lot of them have it. But fixing the visual processing disorder does not fix the dyslexia. Dyslexia does not cause individuals not to be able to read at all. They can read up to a point. Most will hit a wall with their reading by 3rd grade, if not sooner. The one little caveat to that is that the ones that have really good visual memories and can memorize all of those words, they'll go a lot further than 3rd grade before you might even pick up on it. My daughter's one of those. And so there's a lot of times though, I mean, you'll know by 3rd grade because if they're memorizing all their words, let me go back a little bit. So one of the underlying issues with dyslexia is that they cannot process sounds correctly. They can't perceive sounds correctly. And so if you're not really perceiving the sounds correctly, then how in the world are you supposed to sound out words? So the only thing they're left with is memorizing their words. So the ones that have great visual memories, they can memorize a whole lot more words. The ones that don't have such good visual memories, usually by 3rd grade, a lot of times sooner, you'll really see them start to fall apart in their reading because they can't memorize any more words. By 3rd grade, we have all the prefixes and suffixes that come in, and you know, there's just like way too many words to memorize. They're long, they can't figure them out. Trying harder will not make an individual with dyslexia be able to read, write, or spell better. If they are not getting the right instruction, their reading, writing, and spelling will not improve no matter how hard they try. And so a lot of times, we don't know what to do. We're like, read more, try harder, practice longer. Doesn't help. More of the same does not help. We have to teach them differently. Dyslexia is not rare. 40 years of research by the National Institutes of Health has revealed that dyslexia affects 1 in 5 people, which is 20% of the population, but it comes in varying degrees from mild to severe. Not all children who have dyslexia will end up in special education. Only the most severe cases of dyslexia will qualify for special education services under an IEP for specific learning disability. So, essentially, the United States government did 40 years of research trying to debunk dyslexia, and what they did was prove it and then they swept it under the rug because, that's expensive. That's a lot of kids that we have to provide services for. So we'll just try and ignore that, which is why none of us were ever taught about it. For some reason, it's just one of those secret things that we're not supposed to know about. But it affects so many of these kids. And it makes so much sense when you know about it. Oh my gosh, you'll be seeing all of these kids. Oh my gosh, that one has dyslexia, that one has dyslexia. And it's so clear because nothing else looks like dyslexia. Nothing. And so once you know what to look for, you're gonna know what you're looking at, and you're gonna know how to help them. So the other thing I wanted to say here was that the schools do not test for dyslexia specifically. You guys probably all already know this. They test for what's called a specific learning disability, and oftentimes the public schools will not even agree to test until the kids are in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. By that point, they are so far behind, they can catch up, but it takes a long time, and a lot of the emotional damage has already been done. So we want to catch these kids in kindergarten and 1st grade, give them the right instruction, and prevent a lot of this from happening. 5 important things you need to know. Dyslexia is inherited. No one causes it, so neither parents nor children should ever blame themselves. The biggest risk factor for dyslexia is known or suspected dyslexia in a family member. Parents may not be aware that they or other family members have dyslexia because it may not ever have been diagnosed. Most of the time, these parents have never heard of this. They may have heard of it, but they're like, oh no, I don't have that. But then when you start asking these questions about their schooling, and we're gonna get to those questions in a minute, oh yeah, that sounds like, some of them will admit it and be like, oh my gosh. Some of them will get really defensive because they don't want to acknowledge that they gave this to their kid, even though it's just a difference in the way God made their brain. But some of these parents get, especially dads, get extremely defensive and don't want to admit any of it. But there's always a link in the family somewhere. It's typically a parent. Sometimes the parents won't admit it though, but they'll say, oh, my mom was a terrible reader, or my dad was a horrible speller. I'll be like, okay, there's a link there. Multiple brain studies have shown there is a difference in brain structure in individuals with dyslexia. Children with dyslexia do not have a damaged brain, just a different brain structure that causes dyslexia, but also causes these individuals to be very gifted in one or more of the following areas. So you guys can see all of those things that they are very gifted at. This is why there are a whole lot of famous people with dyslexia, because while dyslexia causes difficulties with reading, writing, and spelling, and sometimes math, it also causes people to have these really amazing gifts. And so I always say, if you think about before there was reading and writing, how did we carry on our oral tradition? Or our tradition, I gave it away, but it was oral, right? Oral history, we told stories. Guess what kids with dyslexia are really good at? Telling stories. They can tell you stories all night and all day. They can remember events. They can remember stories really well. It's those little rote random facts that they're not so good at. And so before there's reading and writing, I always say God made people with dyslexia to be superstars because they were the ones carrying on the history. They were the ones that had these amazing gifts in music and art and sports and whatever else, problem solving, and some of these kids can build these huge Lego structures. But then reading and writing came in. Their brains don't process that the same way. They're not really good at it. So then they went from being superstars to being looked at as not smart. And so it's very sad. Children with dyslexia process language differently. They have an unusual nerve pathway that forces language to be processed in a different way than typically developing children. They usually have a huge problem with directionality. They have difficulty telling left from right and up from down, difficulty with time and spatial concepts like before, after, today, tomorrow, greater than, less than, between, around, above, below. Also, telling time on a round clock is really difficult for most of these kids because if you think about being confused about left and right and up and down, let's do clockwise and counterclockwise. And let's say that a quarter after is really a 3 instead of a 25, and that really means 15 minutes. How confusing is that, really? And so, like I was talking about my daughter, and my husband also can't tell time on a round clock. Pretty sure he's dyslexic too, but he never has been able to. And my daughter, we worked, and every time she would not have a digital, She would say, Mommy, what time is it? You tell me what time it is. You have to practice. We'd end up with her crying because I can't, Mommy. And I'm like, well, then we need to practice more. We need to work harder. We need to keep doing this. Didn't matter. So then I ended up with a 12-year-old who still couldn't tell time on a round clock, and I was still badgering her about it until I found out about all this and then went, oh my gosh, she can't do that. And you know what? It doesn't really matter. Because guess what she always has in her pocket? Her cell phone, right? So she always knows what time it is, or she could have a watch if she needed a digital watch. It doesn't matter. It's not a functional skill. So now when she asks me what time it is, I just tell her, because it doesn't matter. Children with dyslexia typically have memory impairments. They have huge difficulties memorizing rote random facts and sequences that seem illogical. This causes them problems memorizing the letters in their last name, the days of the week, the months of the year, the alphabet, their math facts, all of these wonderful things that we ask these kids to do in kindergarten and first grade. These kids are terrible at them. So that's one of the signs that you're going to look for is, wow, they really can't memorize that stuff. There's a reason for that. So our classic warning signs of dyslexia. So on the back of that green paper, one side of it is information about my practice and clinic, and then the other side actually has a list of warning signs that are from Susan Barton. Susan Barton is the dyslexia expert that I was trained by, so that is her list, and she says that if you see 3 or more of those signs, it's very likely dyslexia. A lot of the other, some of the other lists that you'll find out there on the web will say 10 or more. Most of these kids have 10 or more of these, but again, nothing else looks like dyslexia. If they have 3 of these, it's pretty likely. One of the biggest ones is delayed speech and language development. However, not all kids with dyslexia have delayed speech and language development. Not all kids with delayed speech and language development have dyslexia. I'm going to say that a bunch today. It's, of course, not a clear-cut thing. But if the kiddo had delayed speech and language development, it's a big red flag. So the child may be a late talker or be behind in speech and language development. A speech and or language delay should never be ignored. There are many conditions that can cause delays. If you suspect your child may have a speech and language delay, see a speech pathologist as soon as possible. Children with dyslexia may also mispronounce and mix up syllables in multisyllabic words like hangover for hamburger, paschetti for spaghetti, aminal for animal. They also have a really hard time generating words that rhyme. So if you ask them what rhymes with cat, what rhymes with dog, they're not going to be able to tell you that. They might tell you if you say cat, they might say puppy, dog, kitten. They're going to tell you category words. They might say words that start with the same letter, but they don't get rhyming.
At what age are they supposed to stop switching syllables? Because I know little kids do that.
Yeah, they do. And so there's really not an age, but any kid that does that, 3, 4 years old even, it's just something to click away in your little brain, especially by kindergarten if they're still doing that. Another one of those, let's put that away. And again, the rhyming, by the age of 4, they should be able to rhyme. And if they can't rhyme, that's another big red flag. Again, some of these kids can rhyme, but a lot of them can't. So these are signs and symptoms of dyslexia that can be seen in the family tree, even if not formally diagnosed. So this is what I was talking about. If you have a kiddo that you're like, I wonder if this could be dyslexia, you can ask the parent some of these questions. Because if you say, do you have dyslexia? They're either going to say, I have no idea what that is, or they're going to not want to admit to it if they think they do. So if you ask them, typically these are kind of typical things we see in adults. They got C's in school and had to work really hard for those. They had difficulty taking notes in class, avoided writing tasks if at all possible. They're usually able to read, but it's hard work. They're always slow readers. They usually have difficulty with spelling, trouble with capitalization and punctuation. They usually write with short sentences and limited vocabulary. They have trouble learning foreign languages. They have difficulty telling left from right, trouble with directionality words. They may get lost frequently when driving, and they may still confuse B and D when it's very hot. They are under extreme stress, sick, or exhausted. So the B and D confusion, of course, all the ball and stick letters, B, D, P, Q. And again, is that something that, kids reversing letters and all of those things that can be normal when they're little? Yes. But if we're still seeing that after 2 years of handwriting practice, or if they're reversing it when they're reading is also another sign, then it's very definitely a warning sign. And the reason that they do that, there are kids who actually just reverse a bunch of their letters. The B, D, P, and Q thing is actually not a reversal, it's actually a confusion. Because if you think about it, if you're left, right, up, down confused, what are all these ball and stick letters between? They're just a ball and a stick. Which way does it go? Left, right, up, down? I have no idea which way it goes. And so that's a confusion typically. And what we see, even as adults, a lot of times they'll compensate for those. They'll figure out how to work around it. But when you're sick, or you're stressed, or you're tired, and you have to use 100% of your brain all the time to do anything, think about when you're sick and you don't feel good. You can't function at your maximum capacity, right? You're just kind of like, oh, I can't think today. People with dyslexia have to use 100% of their brain all the time to be able to function. And so anytime they're sick or stressed or tired, that's going to decrease their ability to use all their brain function, and you're going to see more mistakes and errors. Word retrieval problems. Typically, these kids have trouble finding their words in their auditory memory, so they're like thinking, oh, what is that word? You get a lot of stuff and things, and those kind of general words, or they'll say a lot. Longer auditory processing time. It takes longer to respond to a question or follow a direction. You got to give these kids a minute. And so, these are the ones that when they're little, they're like, okay, I got to count to 5 and see if they respond. Because if you just keep talking, you'll never get a response from them. But if you give them a little bit of extra time, a lot of times they'll get it because it takes them a little while to process. Significant difficulties with auditory sound discrimination, trouble hearing sounds correctly. So again, we talked about that. There's nothing wrong with their hearing. Typically, it's actually a perception problem between the ear and the brain, and getting that sound in there correctly and figuring out what it is. Phonemic awareness problems, difficulty with pre-reading skills such as rhyming and breaking words into their individual sounds. And a lot of times these are the kiddos that in kindergarten, they'll have a really hard time matching the letters and the sounds and remembering them. History of recurrent ear infections. Research has actually shown that this is caused by one of the genes responsible for dyslexia. So they found 3 genes that dyslexia is on, and one of them is the same gene that causes chronic ear infections. So again, if you have chronic ear infections, doesn't mean you have dyslexia. If you have dyslexia, doesn't mean you have chronic ear infections. However, if they have chronic ear infections and you're noticing some of these other issues, it's very likely it could be dyslexia. Inability to tie their shoes. By the time they start kindergarten, they may not master tying them until they are 8 to 14 years old. These kiddos a lot of times have some fine motor deficits, and they also have difficulty with sequencing, and they also have difficulty with directionality. So tying shoes is kind of a difficult task. We got to go over and around and up and down and remember the sequence and be able to manipulate our fingers the right way. And so typically they're a lot older when they can tie their shoes. A lot of these little kids come in with Velcro on their shoes, so that's kind of a red flag. Ding, 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 ding. They have Velcro, so I'm gonna look for these other things and see. Problems learning the difference between right and left. We already kind of talked about that. Late to establish a dominant hand, which should be by age 4. A dyslexic child may be 7 to 9 years old before a dominant hand is established, and they still may have a dominant hand for different tasks. So there is a myth out there that says that most kids with dyslexia are left-handed. Not true. Out of 50 kids that we see that we tutor, I have 1 that's left-handed, 1. So, and she's a mirror twin. The other one's right-handed. So anyway, but what is true is that they are often ambidextrous. They often use different hands for different tasks, and they usually, a lot of times, not always, again, none of this is set in stone always, because every kid's different, but a lot of them were late to develop their dominant hand. Difficulty in memorizing random and arbitrary facts, the alphabet, the names of the letters, the spelling of their name, especially their last name, their address, phone number, days of the week, months of the year. We already talked about that a little bit. So then, we move up into elementary school. Elementary school students will still show many of the warning signs seen in the preschool years. As they learn to read, they will also start to show odd reading patterns. They may be able to read a word well on one page, but then not on the next page or on a flashcard. They may know their phonics, but not be able to sound out a word. They use context clues and picture clues to read, and they learn to read by repetition and the shape of the words. They can usually read some in the earlier grades, But by the time they get to 3rd grade or even earlier, like I said, they'll hit a wall unless they have a really great visual memory. There are no longer many picture clues. There are also so many different words to know that they can no longer rely on being able to read by the shape of the words. If they have an excellent visual memory for words, they may go much farther in school before anyone recognizes the struggles they are having. And so a lot of these kids in preschool, their parents are like, wow, they're really smart. Because they are. They can answer questions, they ask questions, they're really curious, they tell you stories, they remember these events that, like, I don't even remember that. How do you remember that? But then they start reading and writing, and then you're like, whoa, wait, what happened? What happened to my smart kid? Where did they go? Well, they're still in there. We just have to teach them differently. So children with dyslexia will have difficulty with spelling. They may be able to pass the Friday spelling test if their parents spend hours and hours practicing the words, but they'll forget how to spell the words as soon as the test is over, and they're given a new list of spelling words. They're usually poor at inventive spelling and often leave vowels out of their words. So English vowels are super confusing, you guys all know that. Unfortunately, whoever made up English did us a disservice there because a lot of other languages have very consistent vowels, but our vowels are not consistent and they're super confusing because they make a million different sounds, right? So these kids are extremely confused about vowels, so they'll just leave them out. You'll see lots of syllables without vowels. So if you're seeing that, that's a big red flag. Even when you're doing inventive spelling, they'll leave them out. Penmanship may be terrible in elementary school children with dyslexia. Oh, by the way, we're going to talk more about spelling and accommodations later because spelling tests are terrible for these kids, and we're going to talk about other ways you can do that. Penmanship may be terrible in elementary children with dyslexia. Most students with dyslexia also have dysgraphia, which is the non-automatic handwriting piece that comes along with dyslexia. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute. Children may have dysgraphia without having dyslexia, but most children with dyslexia will have dysgraphia. Even though dyslexic children may have difficulty with the structure and mechanics of writing, their content is usually good. They can tell very detailed and elaborate stories, but not be able to write those on paper. So we talked a little bit about that in the simulation already. And once you start looking at things, samples that dyslexic kids write, or dysgraphic kids write, again, it's really easy to recognize. So signs of dysgraphia. A lot of these kids have an odd pencil grip. Again, not all. The most common one is like I don't have a pen, but the thumb kind of over the top of the first finger instead of an actual tripod grip. It's like up here. That's the one I see the most. But they do really weird things. They put it between their fingers. They write, I don't even know. Some of them write. But it works for them. But we all look at it and go, that's really strange. And changing it's very difficult. They typically can't make letters sit on a line. Inconsistent slant of tall letters, odd beginning and ending points when forming letters. So because they have difficulty remembering rote random sequences, guess what happens every time we pick up our pencil and write a new print letter, right? We have to think, where do I start that letter? Where do I end that letter? How do I form that letter? It's a rote random sequence every time they pick up their pencil, and they can't remember those. So you'll notice that they make the letters different every time they make them because they can't remember the sequence. And so then they look different. Then they'll have odd beginning and ending points. They'll have inconsistent letter sizes, difficulty forming the tails of the letters correctly, odd and inconsistent use of spacing between words. These are the kids where, oh, there's no spaces here and there's a humongous one over here. Extreme difficulty copying from the board or the top of the paper, if you think about it. I'm not really sure what all those letters are or how I make them, and then I have to look up, oh, okay, I got that one. I'll write that one down. Okay, so they copy one letter at a time. They make all kinds of mistakes, and then they didn't learn anything from that at all, because all they did was do one letter at a time, and it's pretty tedious for them. Transition to writing in cursive from print is very difficult, and they almost always will print if given a choice. Those that are taught cursive first may prefer cursive. So when they're taught print first, that becomes as automatic as their handwriting gets. Their handwriting is never automatic, but because they were taught it first, it becomes the most automatic form of handwriting they have, and then reteaching them cursive is usually extremely difficult. They hate it, they can't remember it, it looks awful, and they just never use it. There are a few kids who love the cursive, being taught it later, and will do great. However, if you teach them cursive first, then if you think about it, you don't ever have to pick your pen up and do every single letter, right? It's a whole long connected sequence. It makes so much more sense to them. They don't have to remember all those random rules. They also don't have the problem with flipping the B's and the D's and the P's and the Q's because they look different in cursive. So now there typically can be some MN and UW confusion, those kinds of things. But cursive taught first, a lot of times is much more effective for these kids. Once they've learned print, cursive's really hard, typically, most kids. Again, there's a few exceptions here and there, but. Children with dyslexia will show these common reading mistakes when reading a list of words appropriate for their grade level and also when reading a list of nonsense words. The word they say will have the same shape as the word on the list. House, horse, girl, grill, form, from, first, fast. They usually memorize the words by shape and first and last letter. The word they say will have the exact same letters in a different sequence. Who, how, stop, spot, lots, lost, was, saw, united, untied, accept, expect, sing, sign. They may confuse all the ball and stick letters, B, D, P, and Q. We already talked about that a little bit. Also the up and down letters, N, W, N, U. There's some MN confusion. Some confuse G and J. There are many other sounds and letter confusions that can occur as well. They may leave off or confuse beginning and ending letters on words, prefixes, and suffixes. On words and prefixes and suffixes like needed for need, shoulder, should, every for very. When reading a story, they may leave out or switch around prepositions and function words, and those are all on there. But again, when they're reading it, like they said the, and it was a. How in the world did they see that? Their little dyslexic brain just does. When reading a story, they may say a word that doesn't even start with the same letter or look anything like the word on the page, but may be similar in meaning, such as horse, pony, speed, fast, city, town. A lot of the times that's a picture cue kind of thing. They're just guessing. We'll go back to that for a minute. So one of the things with these kids is that, especially like in Title I programs and those kinds of things that happen, a lot of times they're being taught to guess because these kids can't decode. The teachers don't ever usually know how to teach them to decode. They haven't gotten it the way I teach it. I don't really know how else to teach it. And so they end up being taught these reading strategies, which seem to be great things, but look at the picture, look at the context, all of those things that we teach them as reading strategies, but what we're really teaching them is to guess. And so what they end up doing is they say 5 different words that word could say before they finally get to the right one. Yes, you got it, let's try the next one. Okay, I'm gonna guess 5 different more times. Yes, you got it, right? That's what we do with them because what else do we have? But what is that really teaching them? It's teaching them to guess, and it's not really improving their reading. And so what we have to do is teach them to decode. And there's a specific program that we're going to talk about in a little bit, that some of you may have heard of or not, that actually teaches them to decode. And they have to be taught in a specific way. So what about behavior? At least 40% of children with dyslexia also have ADD or ADHD. ADD and ADHD can cause behavior problems like difficulty focusing and sitting still. We all know that. However, difficult behaviors may also be seen in children with dyslexia because they are not able to read, write, and spell like the other children. Many children, especially boys, will do absolutely anything, including aggressive and violent behaviors to keep people from finding out that they can't read. So kind of like what we were talking about earlier, I'm going to punch Johnny and go to the office because I do not want the other kids to know that I can't read. I would rather sit in the office with my principal and be in trouble than have to read that out loud in class. The girls typically will sit in the back and try not to be noticed. They'll hide. They're the little ones that don't want to say anything. They don't ever volunteer because they don't really answer and they don't want to read aloud, so they'll just try to hide. The boys will typically more often act out and be seen as behavior problems. One of the things about that is that boys tend to get identified more than girls because you're pulling your hair out. What do I do with this kid? He can't sit still. He won't listen. He's punching the other kids. What am I supposed to do? He's biting. He's screaming. Whatever he's doing. And a lot of times the other thing that happens is that, especially the kind of the trend, at least in our area in the public schools, is to identify these kids with attention. That's what kind of the bucket they always want to throw it in. Well, this kid's having trouble. Well, maybe he's having trouble paying attention. Take him and get him tested for ADD. And that's kind of the bucket that they want to throw all of these kids in. When a lot of times what you see that looks like attention problems is really because they're struggling. So just how important is learning to read anyway? 2/3 of students who cannot read proficiently by the end of the fourth grade will end up in jail or on welfare. Staggering statistic. The 4th grade is the watershed year. We can predict that if a child is not reading proficiently in the 4th grade, he or she will have approximately a 78% chance of not catching up. And then we say, when do the public schools usually test these kids? Average is 3rd or 4th grade. The really, really severe ones will get tested possibly in kindergarten or 1st, but may not qualify. But a lot of times, it's 3rd or 4th grade before these kids are even identified. And a lot of them don't get identified at all. They just continue to struggle and continue to fall through the cracks because they're just not failing enough. And a lot of times the teacher's giving them a lot of help, which is awesome, and helping them get through, and their parents are giving them a lot of help. Because what the public schools pretty much say is these kids have to be almost failing to even get tested. And by the time they're failing, think of all the emotional damage that's done to these kids. And so we gotta do something different. 85% of all juveniles who end up in the juvenile court system cannot read well enough to function in adult life. Adult inmates who are not taught to read have a 70% chance of committing another crime and returning to prison after being released. Inmates who are taught to read have only a 16% chance of committing another crime and returning to prison after being released. Because if you think about it, well, I was in prison and I got out, and so it's really hard to get a job just because I've been in prison, and then I can't read. So what am I supposed to do? I can't even fill out a job application. How am I supposed to live? What am I supposed to do? Oh, I may as well just go back to jail because, I got 3 hots and a cot there. I don't have to struggle. I may as well just go there because I know that. It's comfortable. It's not comfortable, but I mean to them, it's known versus the unknown of, I can't get a job, I'm gonna be homeless on the street, and I can't provide for my family. May as well just go back to prison. Illiteracy and crime are closely related. The Department of Justice states the link between academic failure and delinquency, violence, and crime is welded to reading failure. Over 70% of adult inmates in America's prisons cannot read above a 4th grade level. And again, you say, the government knows this, but they're not addressing the issue of dyslexia. So, the importance of phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is the core and causal factor that separates normal readers from disabled readers. This is a statement by G. Reed Lyon. He was actually the director of the National Institutes of Research all of those years when they did all those 40 years of reading, research into dyslexia. So phonemic awareness is the ability to hear and manipulate sounds within a 1-syllable word in your head. Phonemic awareness is an absolutely essential pre-reading skill. No amount of phonics teaching will work if the child doesn't already have phonemic awareness skills. So this is huge. So typically developing kids who don't have dyslexia, when they're little, they hear us talk. And they figure out how sounds go into words, and words go into sentences, and sentences go into conversation, and they just figure all that out. We don't have to teach it to them. Kids with dyslexia, they don't figure that out naturally. So we have to teach them every single piece of it. And that's what I'm going to tell you guys about later, is the way that we do that. But if they do not have that underlying phonemic awareness, it doesn't matter how much phonics we teach them. They're not going to get it. They might get part of it, but they're not going to get all of it. And it's going to cause them to be a slow reader, a disabled reader, a bad speller, all of those things that we, hold such high esteem in our society. If you can't read, write, and spell, they must be stupid, right? I mean, that's kind of what society says. It's not true. Because these kids, actually the definition of dyslexia is that they have average to above average intelligence. So we have all of these kids with average to above average intelligence who cannot read, write, and spell very well. And they're seen as stupid, but they're not. And they have way more potential than we are allowing them to reach. One more important thing you must know about phonemic awareness: if a child has age-appropriate phonemic awareness skills, they can learn to read with any method. You can even do whole language. It doesn't matter. They're going to learn to read with any method. Lack of phonemic awareness skills will cause a child to become a disabled reader, usually by 3rd grade. Again, if they have good visual memory skills, they'll go further. No traditional reading teaching method will get them past the wall they will hit in their reading. The students with better visual memory for words will go a lot further in their reading before you notice difficulties. So how do we check for phonemic awareness in young children? Again, we talked about rhyming. So this is one thing you can do with little kids, tell them to rhyme for you. What rhymes with cat? What rhymes with dog? By the age of 4, they really should be able to do this. A dyslexic child may give you category words instead of words that rhyme. They may say, if you say what rhymes with dog, they may say puppy, cat, kitten. And these kids, you can't even teach them what it is to rhyme. You try and tell them over and over and over again. You try and explain it, they don't get it. They don't hear it. It doesn't make sense. Can the child separate a word into individual sounds or blend a word from individual sounds? Again, these are all these little tests we do in kindergarten, right? So we already have this data. Like, teachers do this all the time. They give them a little test and say, tell me the first sound of the word, tell me the last sound of the word, tell me the middle sound of the word. If they can't do that, big red flag. Can they identify what they hear in the beginning, middle, and end of the word? So, if you suspect that one of your kiddos has dyslexia, we're going to talk about some things that do and don't work. And again, we're going to talk more about what to do this afternoon. Programs that don't work with children with dyslexia, though they may be great programs for typical learners or students who have other learning difficulties. Hooked on Phonics or any traditional phonics program. Now, do we need to be teaching our kids phonics? Yes, absolutely we need to be teaching our kids phonics. It just so happens that the kids with dyslexia aren't so good at that. And so we need to teach them a different way, but they definitely need to be taught phonics. And we don't want all of our kids memorizing our words. It is not an efficient way to learn to read. Reading recovery, read naturally, accelerated reader. So, again, these are great programs for kids who don't have dyslexia. One of the things they use, accelerated reader in my kids' school, in my kids' school, I don't know if you guys use that, or, but you probably use some kind of a program where you're motivating kids to read, right? So the accelerated reader has points, so they have they set a goal for the individual student, so this kid may only need 15 points and this kid needs 100 points, depending on their reading level. And they're also only reading, if I'm a third grader, but I'm only at a first grade reading level, then I'm only reading first grade level books, and I have to get 15 points, versus if I'm a third grader and I'm reading a third grade level, then I'm reading third grade level books, and maybe I have to get 100 points. They read the book, they have to take a test. So, a comprehension test. And based on how they do on that, then they get their points. What happens to these kids is that, and I always thought, oh, that's great, they're motivating them to read, but what I've since discovered is that my kids, and again, my daughter has dyslexia, but it's not severe, so she did okay with this, and she'd always meet her goal, and we'd have to work on it, but she'd get there, and she'd get to go to the party. They get a party, they get an ice cream party, or I don't know, one time they got to go throw paper snowballs at each other in the gym, They get to go do something fun. Guess what happens to the kids who don't meet their goal? They have to go sit in the office while all the other kids get to go have an ice cream party. How horrifying and terrible for those kids. And guess what? They didn't do it. They did not read because they didn't want to. They didn't do it because they couldn't. They couldn't meet that goal. It's too hard. And so we're basically punishing those kids because we're not teaching them correctly, which is so sad, and it just breaks my heart. So now I say, if you're going to do a program like that, make sure the kids that are struggling with reading can listen with their ears to audiobooks and answer the questions, because they can do that. They're really good at that. They understand the material. They just can't decode it. So we'll talk more about that later, but off my soapbox. Vision therapy or colored overlays. Again, there are kids who have visual processing disorders. There are kids who have something called Irlen syndrome, where the bright lights affect their eyes and they need colored overlays. That is true, that does happen. It does not fix dyslexia. It can help them, be able to see the print better. So you might see a little bit of improvement, but it doesn't fix that underlying issue that they're not perceiving those sounds correctly. Brain gym or other exercise programs, again, great programs. They're great for kids. They help them learn the movement and everything. It's great. It doesn't fix dyslexia. Sylvan Score, Kuman Center tutoring programs. Sylvan will even, I've had parents tell me Sylvan said we don't do Orton Gillingham, which is what we're going to talk about later. They say that they're loosely based, but I've had parents spend thousands and thousands of dollars at Sylvan with barely any progress, and then they come to us and they make huge progress. Ron Davis' Gift of Dyslexia, I've never read it, but Susan Barton says it's a scam, so Special diets or medications. Again, there are kids who need special diets and medications. It will help them overall. It will not fix dyslexia. So if you're investigating any type of treatment, ask for published research. If they can't provide it, buyer beware. So if all of that doesn't work, what does? The only research-based methodology that has been proven to help individuals with dyslexia is called Orton-Gillingham. The International Dyslexia Association also calls this structured literacy now, so you might hear that term as well. This technique was created in the 1930s and has been used successfully for 80 plus years. 1930s, this has been around. This is what just, it's so sad. So Orton-Gillingham has a weird name because it was created by a doctor and a linguist, one named Orton, one named Gillingham. And they, back in the 1930s, recognized that there were these kids that were just really struggling to learn to read. And so they created this program, and it works. And it's the only thing that's ever been proven to work. So I always keep forgetting to put this on the slide. So there's 3 components to Orton-Gillingham. It has to be explicit, sequential, and multisensory. So explicit means we teach them absolutely everything. Again, like I said, they didn't get this naturally, so we have to go all the way back to the sounds. We have to make sure that they have all of those sounds intact and that they know what letter says what sound and how all of that works. So phonemic awareness, phonological awareness is extremely important. Again, if they don't have that basis, they're not going to be able to do well in reading and spelling. Sequential, we start at the beginning and we step by step work up. And we have to teach them absolutely everything, and then it must be multisensory. And so a lot of teachers do a great job with multisensory techniques. You know, you tap up the arm, you write things in the air, you write things on shaving cream, you do all of those things. Multisensory must be a part of reading teaching for kids with dyslexia. It's the way that it gets to the part of their brain that processes dyslexia, or that processes reading, writing, and spelling. Research has shown that children with dyslexia must have intense tutoring and interventions with an Orton-Gillingham-based system in order to overcome their challenges and learn to read, write, and spell successfully. Nothing else has ever been proven to work. About 85% of children are ready for an Orton-Gillingham-based system in kindergarten. If they are not, it's recommended that they have tutoring in limited Bell programs or a new program called Foundation in Sounds until they have the basic phonemic awareness skills needed to be successful in an Orton-Gillingham system. There is a program actually out of Indianapolis that's called, it's called the M.A. Rooney Foundation, and they actually got a grant, and they've been doing a pilot project for over 5 years in IPS, and it's actually classroom-based Orton-Gillingham instruction for kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade. There actually are free 90-minute, 180-day lesson plans online for your language arts blocks. That and they will actually come out to your schools and train you for free as well. Yeah, so I have their website on there. But this is, like I've been telling all these, like if we can get these kids in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, it's going to change this whole community. Now, there are kids who are more severe that are going to need additional intensive instruction outside of this. But the ones that kind of have the mild to moderate dyslexia, this is probably all they're going to need, and they're never going to struggle the way the other kids struggle. But you do have to do it with fidelity, and it's amazing because there's no planning. It's all already there. Once you're trained, you just have to get your materials together for that day, and you're good to go. So that is a great resource that's out there. Orton-Gillingham-based systems, these are some of them. So Orton-Gillingham is a big umbrella. There are a whole lot of programs underneath Orton-Gillingham. The one we use at our clinic is the Barton Reading and Spelling System. I have not had experience with these other ones, but I have had other teachers tell me that some of them are good. Does the child need a diagnosis of dyslexia before starting tutoring? Identification of dyslexia is not needed before starting an Orton-Gillingham-based program. Orton-Gillingham-based instruction will help all children learn to read, which is why I say this is what we should be teaching all of these kids. They all learn to read that way, and we are not leaving these 5 to 6 children in every single classroom behind because they're going to get it too. Diagnosis, identification of dyslexia will be helpful in order to get accommodations and services that your child needs at school. Orton-Gillingham-based services at school, typically no. There are some schools around, I think, that do some of this, and again, there's becoming more and more awareness. Indiana just passed a dyslexia law that goes into effect in 2019. So this is going to become more and more on the forefront, thankfully, finally, because we are way behind as a state, near the bottom as far as all of this goes. Again, in education, we're near the bottom, unfortunately. But hopefully this will make a huge difference. Decoding Dyslexia and the Indiana Dyslexia Association worked for 10 years behind the scenes to get this law passed. I was shocked that it passed the first time they introduced it, but then I found that out. They've been doing all of that groundwork behind the scenes. However, again, we don't have all the details of the law yet. The public schools are going to find ways to do the bare minimum, I'm sure, when in reality, if they would do things the right way, it wouldn't really cost them all that much money. But schools do not test for dyslexia. They test for specific learning disability. Even if you get an outside diagnosis of dyslexia, your child still may not qualify for special education services under an IEP or ISP. With an official identification of dyslexia and or ADHD, the child should be eligible for a 504 plan, which is a plan to help students who have medical diagnoses succeed in school. It's the responsibility of the individual school to write 504 plans, so actually it's not the public school's job. If you're in a private school, it's the private school's job to write those 504 plans. This is separate from the special education testing progress. Parents sometimes have to be very persistent in requesting services and accommodations at school. One of the big things with 504 plans, though, is that first of all, you're legally obligated to write them if you receive federal funding. I don't know if you guys do or not, but even if you're not legally obligated to write them, it helps the kids get what they need, and it also means that they get accommodations on their standardized testing. So if you guys give iStep or iLearn or iRead or any of those, this is the only way they can get accommodations on those tests, and that's what these kids need to be able to pass them. So if you want your test scores to come up, write some 504 plans for these kids. You gotta get them identified first, you gotta get parents to take them for testing, you gotta get all of those things in place, but if you can get a 504 plan on these kids, then they can feel more successful and your test scores go up. So it's a win-win for everybody. Most schools do not offer Orton-Gillingham-based services, even if OG services are provided at school. Additional intensive outside tutoring may be needed to help the child catch up in their reading, writing, and spelling skills. For maximum success, again, we say get the child identified with dyslexia and or ADHD as soon as possible. This is where you have to work with your parents. Once you've gone, oh, I think this could be an issue, talk to the parents and try to get them to do something. These identifications will help with the child what he needs at school. The child needs Orton-Gillingham-based tutoring services as soon as possible. And parents should be proactive and persistent in asking for classroom accommodations at school and also use them at home. There's lots of technology tools and apps, and we're going to talk about those this afternoon. So, early intervention makes all the difference. Starting tutoring as soon as warning signs are identified is important. Children who receive Orton-Gillingham-based tutoring and instruction in kindergarten and first grade never have to experience the failure and embarrassment that students with dyslexia usually face. However, it's never too late to get the right type of instruction and tutoring. If the child is already older, they will still be successful with Orton-Gillingham-based tutoring. Do not delay, get them help as soon as possible. It will transform their lives and their entire future. We've even worked with some adults. It works, it just works. Make sure to give them time to grow their gifts, whether they be art, music, athletics, mechanical skills. They need to feel successful as much as possible, and I always say, who knows, they might have a Picasso or a Mozart or a Michael Jordan right in their own family, because all those people have dyslexia, along with a whole slew of other famous people. And so you have this on there, just some places you can find dyslexia services, and some information if parents have difficulty paying for services. There's not a lot out there, unfortunately, but these are some ideas. And then advocates and legal help, and especially with you guys being a private school, if the parents are having trouble getting the public schools to test or to do what they're supposed to, then these are great resources to give to the parents. Indiana Disability Rights, both of these are free, and so if Indiana Disability Rights will take their case, they give them a free advocate, but they also have lawyers behind it. So if it gets to that point, then there's lawyers available. And sometimes with the public schools, it gets to that point, unfortunately. And then InSource is just a resource for free advocates. So I always tell parents, call IDR first, because if you need a lawyer, it's going to be there for free. But if they won't take your case, then they'll send you the information for InSource. Then some resources. So the Dyslexia Empowerment Plan is a fantastic book. It's written by a severe dyslexic himself. I always say if you're going to get one book on dyslexia, get this one. It's a very easy read if you like to read. If not, you can listen, because you can get it in audio version. The first one, the Dyslexia Empowerment Plan by Ben Foss. So Amazon, I know, has it in audiobook version. They do have this book at our library in Anderson, so potentially they might have it at other libraries. But it is a really, really fantastic book. He talks a lot about his own journey, but also the emotional component, how to help the kids, through that, how to navigate the education system, and kind of what the future looks like, jobs and careers and college and all of those kinds of things that parents worry about. The Dyslexic Advantage and Overcoming Dyslexia, both really excellent books, much more technical. So if you've got a parent who wants some information, I'd give them the Ben Foss book. But as teachers, you guys might be interested. Lots more research in those books and much more technical, but very, very interesting. Healing ADD is a great book if you have kids that you think might have some ADD issues. There's actually 7 different kinds of ADD, which I never knew until I got into all this. But this book, it talks about medication, but it also talks about what else can you do? Supplements, diet, exercise, and behavior plans, those kinds of things. So I just think it's a really good resource. That first website, mareadyfoundation.org, that's the one with all of the free lesson plans and to get the free training about the classroom work in Gillingham. DYS/ADD.com is Susan Barton's website. Dyslexia.yale.edu is Sally Shaywitz's website. HeadstrongNation.org is Ben Foss's website, so you'll see the books up there. Dyslexia IDA is the Indiana Dyslexia Association. Learning Ally and Bookshare, we'll talk more about those this afternoon. They're the audiobook databases. And then Dyslexic Advantage is actually Brock and Furnett ID's website. They're out of one of the other Ivy League schools, but I can't remember which one. I'm sorry, there's Indiana IDA. Dyslexia IDA is actually the international. So lots of good resources there. And I believe that's the end of our morning. So just a thank you to you guys for being willing to come and learn, and also to Susan Barton, who I got most of my information from. So we'll break for lunch.
We're going to try to be back here about 12:45, 12:50 to get started again, because our afternoon, we need to get everything in and not keep you long. So let's have a quick prayer, and then I encourage you to hustle to the calf. When you go in, they might be still in their chapel that they actually have in the calf. Go ahead and they're coming in here? Okay, we're leaving. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the information, Lord. Help us to process. Please be with us now and bless our food, bless our time together to fellowship. In Jesus' name, amen.
Take all our stuff with you. I would, yeah. Yeah, you can take it. So I'm so glad. Like, we're the only, that's our foundation. And I actually, yeah, she was in the IBA. I went to the IBA conference in Orlando. So a lot of times she said, like, it's in my grade, but
if you want to see what hand,
yeah, that's what it might be.